What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and this is Assetto Corsa, where today we're going to be taking a look at another car from Porsche pack number 2, and that would be the 911 GT1-98. This is the 1998 24 Hours of Le Mans overall winner. It actually finished 1-2 in that race, and it is quite possibly the worst Porsche to ever win at Le Mans. So let's go ahead and get into the video where we're going to have a little bit of 6 degrees of 911 GT1. Alrighty, so we fired up a grid of period competitors at Le Mans, although none of these cars really competed directly against one another. So at the back of the pack here we have the McLaren F1 GTRs, same car that won Le Mans overall in 1995, the GT1 car that played by the spirit of the rules and won, and you have a late GT1 era car in the 98 GT1, which was sort of, by that point, everybody's building prototypes, so screw that. And then, of course, at the very front, we have the Mercedes-Benz CLR, which that's a mod from United Racing Designs that you can find really just there for field filler here in this case. But at that point, they basically gave up calling them GT cars and said, hey, you know what, let's just call it LMGTP, Le Mans Grand Touring Prototype, because everybody knew that's what was going on. And it's pretty silly to try and continue calling them GT cars when they were just prototypes that they happened to sell, quote unquote, a few road going versions, quote unquote. I'm pretty sure most of the road going versions of the GT1 cars ended up actually going to either executives within the brand or to their museum. So hard to call that a sale, but still really cool anyways. Definitely, you know, one of the coolest eras of GT racing at the top level. You know, you maybe didn't have all the cars and all the manufacturers and all the customer racing going on, you know, compared to certain other eras that you could think of. But at the same time, just the type of car being developed and what was possible. If you don't like the late 90s GT1 cars, there's something wrong with you. But, as for the GT1-98 here in Assetto Corsa, it's definitely a slightly peculiar beast, in my opinion. So first of all, the transmission, 6-speed, lever-operated sequential, if you're doing things properly. But it automatically cuts the throttle on upshifts, it automatically blips the throttle on downshifts. Seems kind of strange, but not sure what the regulations held in terms of paddle shifting, but you know, it works. It's just kind of strange in my opinion, but I imagine back then it was something that was plenty nice. I don't know, whenever I'm using the sequential, you know, lever action, I always feel like I gotta blip the throttle on downshifts, but I need to remember not to in this car. But then, this car has one assist available, and that is ABS. Not traction control, but ABS. Again, seems kind of strange here usually today, modern times. Cars, you know, race cars generally have traction control if they only have one of the two, not ABS. You know, again, nothing too difficult, nothing too radical, but just kind of a little bit like, it's kind of weird. But as for actually driving this car beyond that, this engine is not necessarily what you'd expect. At least, certainly not what I was expecting. I'm running West Wing, so that way we won't flip over. But this engine is a 3.2 liter flat 6 twin turbo. If I'm not mistaken, I do believe it's actually the same engine, only with mild updates from the 962. You know, from that family, which you can go back and trace that back to the 935 even. I'm sure you could actually technically even go further back than that, because that's what Porsche does. But Yeah, it definitely feels almost exactly like that engine from the 962. You know, it's definitely lethargic by modern standards. And that's something that'll be interesting to note and remember later on when I talk kind of about the 6 degrees of 911 GT1. But so the power delivery, it's definitely gonna need to be spooled up. In terms of how the car drives otherwise, very skittish. Very skittish. Once this thing gets into oversteer, it really just stays put. And you're just kind of along for the ride at that point. It's definitely not a car that necessarily inspires confidence with its controllability. Whereas at the same time, you know, for example, the McLaren F1 here in Assetto Corsa, if you do make a mistake, you can still, you know, manhandle a little bit. You can still work with the car and generally pull it out of most smaller moments. Whereas this car, once it's gone, it's definitely gone more often than not. So definitely keep your eyes out on that. And something I did find interesting, not so much of an issue here at Monza, but going to other circuits, at other tracks which require more downforce, they've pulled a Sauber C9 on us again, and it really grinds my gears. It really grinds my gears. Because if you go back and look at the showroom picture at the beginning, or if you have just noticed this on the car in your own gameplay, they've gone ahead and made the car without any dive planes, with, you know, Le Mans Aero, which is perfectly legitimate. I mean, that's what this car is most known for by a long shot. But if you look at pictures throughout the 98 season, you'll see that they did occasionally run dive planes on the nose of the car to get more downforce. And that really becomes an issue because this car, otherwise on tighter, twistier circuits, just becomes a dump truck. You know, there's just no grip at the front compared to you know, sort of what you can get away with here at Monza, where downforce isn't nearly as useful. So it would have really been nice to have the ability to, you know, not necessarily visually on the 3D model, that's not really a big deal, but in the garage menu to add a click of front downforce to really hopefully get the car to actually turn in. At least that's my opinion. It's definitely a bit of a beast in that sense. It really just kind of goes straight. But anyways, on to 911 GT1, 6 degrees of separation going on here. So basically, let's go through a little bit of primer here at Le Mans. Well, not here. Yeah, you guys know what I'm saying. But in 1995, the McLaren F1 GTR wins Le Mans overall. It's essentially the McLaren F1 turned into a road car because owners of the McLaren F1 wanted to go race it. Simple as that. So they raced in the GT1 car, you know, complied with the letter of the law in terms of the rules and regulations, as well as, I think most everyone would agree, the spirit of the rules, where it's supposed to be a class, GT1, for GT cars turned into race cars. You know, like the McLaren F1, like the Ferrari GTE F40, which, why do we not have that car, Kunos? Please, for all that is holy. But, you know, GT cars turned into race cars, not race cars turned into street cars. Well, of course, the McLaren F1 was really successful in 1995, and because, you know, hey, lots of people really love Porsches, and because Porsche likes to build race cars, and they like to win races, they like to dominate, they make the original, the OG mid-engine 911, and the 911 GT1 for the 1996 season. which is essentially the front end of a 993 grafted onto the back end of a 962. And they made a couple street versions, quote unquote, to comply with the regulations of being a production car. They sold it to, you know, all the customer teams. They raced it themselves. In 1996, they actually won the GT1 class at Le Mans with the factory 911 GT1s. But it was pretty clear the GT1 class was about to go absolutely nuclear. And in hindsight, it did. And it gave us some of the most glorious race cars ever. But for 1997, Nissan would be joining in the fray with sort of the first indications of a prototype turned street car in the R390 GT1, although not nearly as crazy as some of the later examples. So they knew that Nissan would be joining. They knew that their competitors weren't going to stand still. You know, 1997 saw the introduction of the long-tail McLaren F1 with better aerodynamics, more downforce, better transmission. You know, so obviously Porsche not going to stand still. They come out with the 911 GT1 Evo, which was basically the same thing, lightened up, improved, more power, you know, further improvements. Now that car, not necessarily as successful as the 96 version. And of course, again, because Porsche, they weren't about to just stand around. They wanted to dominate. They wanted to crush the competition. Well, about that. So they knew they needed a new car, or a heavily updated car, to win in 1998. They created this car with, you know, all sorts of improvements designed to make the car more competitive. And it did win one race. It did win the 24 Hours of Le Mans overall when everybody else broke. But otherwise, Mercedes-Benz absolutely destroyed everyone. They won all 10 races of the FIA GT series. The only race they didn't win was Le Mans. Interestingly enough, Mercedes switched from the V12, if I'm not mistaken, to a V8 for Le Mans, citing that the V8 was going to be more durable, whereas the V12 probably might not have lasted all 24 hours. The V8s all failed before midnight. All the Mercedes were out of the race. And then the 911 GT1 here, the 98 version, basically cleaned up the scraps. And what, kind of looking back, was the last of the old school Le Mans, where it was an endurance race first, sprint race second, and it's widely considered that the 1999 race, which was one of the greatest races ever, just in terms of lineup and how the race unfolded, is widely considered the first race that was a 24-hour sprint race rather than, you know, drive as fast as you can, but make the car last for 24 hours. So this car did win Le Mans. It did win the biggest race. It did win the race that matters if you're going to win one. But otherwise, it did nothing. And Porsche knew this. So for 1999, where things get kind of a little bit more interesting, they didn't do anything because this car would not be able to compete with the Toyota GT1 or alternatively the Mercedes CLR. Yeah, it just wasn't up to scratch. It was a GT car-ish, souped up for racing rather than basically a purpose-built prototype. Now the rules were changing and prototypes were going to become the norm going forward, so Porsche decided that they were going to sit out 1999 and develop a car for 2000. And here's where I think things get really interesting in the whole 6 degrees spectrum of this car. And actually the engine was cited as one of the reasons why they just weren't going to be competitive in 1999, which is a big factor to mention here. So they weren't going to be competitive, they knew it, so they're going to sit out the season, build an open-top prototype, which was going to be what the rules were going to favor, for 2000. Now they built that car, and it's a car that for the very longest time, Porsche refused to acknowledge even existed ever. It was the worst kept secret. It basically became known as the Porsche LMP 2000. And, you know, it's a car that, for all intents and purposes, did not exist until, I think, actually this year, where they finally acknowledged that they had built a car and they had studied the regulations. But they decided not to do it. The reason why they didn't build the LMP 2000 was because they wanted to build the Cayenne. Well, not necessarily wanted to, but it was determined that that would be more beneficial than building another sports car and winning Le Mans, quite possibly. Way too deep. So very interesting that because this car, in theory, you know, I'm sure it's not necessarily just this simple, but this car was not nearly good enough to compete, which is one of the very weirdest things to say about a Porsche, in my opinion. Let's get a big time frame rate spike there. Time drop. Hopefully that won't be too big of an issue. But because this car wasn't good enough, they sat out a season, and then they decided that, you know, hey, we're not going to go racing in 2000. An open top prototype. We're going to go ahead and make an SUV that's, quite frankly, you know, the Cayenne has been exceptionally divisive in people's opinions. Some people think it's the worst thing that Porsche has ever done and total sacrilege. Other people look at it in a more you know, commercial sense, where it was the smartest thing anyone has ever done for a sports car manufacturer to start building SUVs, and it certainly hasn't really compromised the brand and the performance of their cars. So, you know, you got that going for it, because this car was too crappy. And then interestingly, the LMP 2000, the car that never was, the V10 that was going to power that car, and I believe a couple of the mechanical components, and it really heavily influenced the design of a certain car. That car would, of course, be one of the most legendary supercars of all time, the Carrera GT. So really, when you think about it, you end up in a weird situation where, because a Porsche wasn't competitive enough in GT racing, they basically went elsewhere, developed the most non-Porsche car around in an SUV, although they still kind of did it the way that they do things, and at the same time simultaneously created what a lot of people would say is one of the greatest sports cars of all time. You know, one of the, you know, last truly analog, manly man supercars, you know. So you basically got a little bit of a 962, but you could even go back to a little bit of 935 in this car, and then you got a little bit of the future of what would become Porsche. And I don't know, I find it very fascinating. It's very strange to think that, you know, maybe if this car was better, you know, maybe they would have decided to fight it out with Mercedes and with Toyota with the LMGTP specification of cars. And if they did that, you figure maybe they don't end up building that LMP 2000. Or alternatively, what if they did build the LMP 2000? Could you imagine a world where Porsche was racing against the almighty, all-dominant Audi R8, the good one, not the GT car, the one that just destroyed everybody? Just think how different of a brand Porsche would be without the surrounding of this car. So I'll go ahead and remain silent here for a lap or so as we're winding down to the end of the race. You guys listen to the sounds. Alrighty, and that's that. That'll finish the race off there. So as usual with these videos, I'll put a trackside replay camera, and hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.